What's up, guys? Welcome back to the DC Squad Pod. It's me, your host, Chris, with our co-host, Cameron. So we're going to talk about some of the things that have gone down since our last podcast. There's been a few draft day trades. There's been a few just moves going on in the NFL, and then we're going to answer some fan questions from Instagram at the end of the podcast. So to open up, we're going to talk about a few draft moves that happened, some people switching positions in the upcoming NFL draft. News just broke right before this live stream that the Panthers traded for Jets quarterback Sam Darnold, and they gave up a 6th-round pick this year and a 2nd and 4th rounder in 2022. And then the 49ers moved up to the 3rd pick with the Dolphins, and the Eagles moved down from the 6th pick to the 12th pick. And there's just a lot going on in the NFL drafts. Cameron, how is that going to impact what kind of prospects are still going to be available for the Dallas Cowboys on draft day?
Well, first, I'll talk about today with everything with Sam Darnold. Of course, there was a lot of questions where the Panthers are going to take Zach Wilson. There was a lot of talk from especially Mel Kiper at ESPN talking about potentially Mac Jones moving up. And then you see the 49ers move up to the 3rd. That might be another quarterback off the board because you never really know with Garoppolo. Of course, with the Dolphins, you have the same thing. Are they stuck with Tua? But if there's not as many quarterbacks that are going to go into the top 10, that takes away from what Dallas could take at 10. Because you would think a guy like Penei Sewell or a guy like Rashawn Slater would go to one of those teams that would be up there. And then if those are gone, when we get to around 8 or 9 with the Panthers, that could impact possibly a corner going as well. And that could limit what Dallas has as their option.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very interesting to note. I think with the Dolphins moving down from the 3rd pick, 49ers are definitely, I think, going quarterback with that 3rd pick. That's the only reason you would move up that high in a draft and give up that much draft capital. And the Dolphins are really a team that could have actually gone with a skill position at 3, honestly, because, I think they were going to go with Tua and stick with him. So that means more quarterbacks are going to be taken, which is good for the Dallas Cowboys. I think the Eagles moving down from 6th pick to the 12th pick, it's going to be interesting. It makes the Cowboys pick ahead of them for a 2nd straight year, which could be interesting how that plays out. I think it's interesting too. I think it's a good move, for the Eagles because they are getting some serious draft capital over the next 2 seasons. I mean, they could potentially have 3 first-round picks in the 2022 draft with that Dolphins pick, and then that Colts pick that was a 2nd rounder, but if Carson Wentz is healthy and plays most of the season, that can turn into a 1st-round pick. So I think that it's going to lead. Those 2 trades were good for Dallas in a sense, but I think this Panthers move wasn't necessarily great for the Cowboys.
This one definitely hurt us.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're looking for like a Kyle Pitts or someone to fall to pick 10. Because the Panthers were a team that were kind of, in the mix, I should say, for a quarterback possibly, and they could have tried to trade up. But now with them trading for Sam Darnold, I think they'll definitely use that pick that they got to try and draft a skill position like Kyle Pitts, maybe even go wide receiver. Or honestly, go. I don't think cornerback is out of the question either. I think they could still add to the cornerback room that they have, which is clearly the Cowboys' biggest need at the moment. So, yeah, it's very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and then I'm talking about the Dolphins moving down from that 3rd. I thought at the 3rd pick they might have even reached and gone for a guy like Devontae Smith, reunite him with Tua from Alabama. I thought that was an opportunity. And now, of course, they're at 6. He might still be there, so it really just depends on how you look at it. Of course, Trevor's going to go first. It might be 3 straight quarterbacks off the board, especially when you see San Francisco move up there. It could be Trevor, then Zach, then Justin Fields. Then after that, it's kind of shaky because you don't know what a team like the Bengals is going to go with. It'll be an interesting thing to see on draft day. And then you talked about how we're picking before the Eagles. Of course, they're never really going to let go of us stealing CeeDee Lamb from them before they were able to draft him. That's one that'll always be in the back of Eagles fans' minds. And then let's say a guy like Kyle Pitts, even though I'm not part of the Pitts fandom, if he were to fall to Dallas and we get him, I think that would be another stain for the Eagles.
Yeah, it would definitely be, I think, a situation where Jerry Jones would have to consider is it almost worth
Mhm.
taking a guy like Kyle Pitts just to not play him twice a year for the foreseeable future?
Mhm.
Because let's say the Cowboys don't pick up a Kyle Pitts and he falls deeper into the draft and he lands with someone in the division. I mean, and then he ends up being an all-pro type of player. That'll always be a question if
Mhm.
Jerry Jones made the right decision on that. So let's pivot off the draft for a minute and let's talk about KJ Wright. At Dean of the Court asked me if there's any update with KJ Wright. So according to CowboysSportsIllustrated.com's Mike Fisher, KJ Wright says the Cowboys are a dream destination, and the two teams have talked for a few days. And the Cowboys would like a 1-year deal, while Wright is currently looking for a 2-year deal. Wright says that Dallas has certainly always been on my list of dream teams with Coach Dan Quinn there, and with other aspects of that team and that defense, I do think it's one of the teams I fit in with. Talk about a potentially big offseason acquisition. How would you like
Mhm.
to see KJ Wright in the silver and blue this upcoming season?
Some people might not realize, but this has been the most active the Cowboys have been in free agency, possibly in franchise history when you're regarding the numbers of guys they signed. Of course, they're all not the Earl Thomases of the world like people were talking about in recent years. But a guy like KJ Wright, a Super Bowl champion, he had 7 tackles in that game. He was a part of that defense, that Legion of Boom, and I think he can be a part of somewhat of a recreation if that's what Dan Quinn is wanting here in Dallas. And I think talking about that 2-year deal, I think Dallas would be better off to go for a 2-year deal regarding him, because when you talk about that TV deal coming in, you want to extend guys for as long as you can, because once that goes through, people are going to be almost doubling sometimes. So I think there'll be things talked about. They'll go back and forth, but I think Dallas is probably the favorite right now to sign him, but we'll just have to see how time tells.
Yeah, I think the Cowboys show a tendency of being very patient throughout free agency
Mm-hmm.
and, just letting things come to them. I would bet on KJ Wright becoming a Cowboy at some point, whether that's tonight, tomorrow, or closer to the season. It could be in the
Mm-hmm.
preseason that ends up happening.
Of course.
But I definitely think that would be a great move for the Cowboys with the question marks that our linebackers have shown in terms of their production on the field, but also with their injuries. I mean, Leighton Vander Esch is constantly struggling to stay on the field,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't even know if Sean Lee's gonna retire, if he's gonna play next season. So I think if we can add some linebacker depth and a proven player like KJ Wright, I certainly think
Mm-hmm.
that that's something that the Cowboys should heavily consider.
Yeah, I also agree. I think you talk about that. You also talk about Jalen Smith had some inconsistencies last year. There's a lot of holes. They lost to Joe Thomas. Putting in a veteran like KJ Wright gives you security there. Of course, I think he'll start on the team regardless, even if he wasn't. Let's say a guy like Sean Lee retires, Leighton gets hurt, Jalen gets hurt. You can't go wrong with a guy like KJ Wright adding him, and I don't think he'll be an expensive deal if he were to make it.
Yeah, for sure. So, in some other news, former Cowboys defensive lineman Tyrone Crawford officially retired, and he spent 8 seasons with the Dallas Cowboys. He signed that a big extension a few years ago that a lot of fans have been critical that he hasn't lived up to. But how do you feel about the Cowboys losing Tyrone Crawford to retirement?
I don't think it'll be felt too heavily, especially with all the young guys like Gallimore, guys like Tristan Hill coming in, and then the edges are figured out. You got DeMarcus Lawrence, you got Randy Gregory, and you've got guys like Bradley and if that's how you pronounce his name, that you'll be good with for years to come. And a lot of people, of course, were skeptical of that contract. I was one of those people, and then injuries plagued him, and that's led to this day where he's retiring. And I think he was a good leader. I think that's the biggest thing they'll miss from him. But at the end of the day, you take your nicks and you just got to keep moving with it. So respect to what Crawford did, but Cowboys got to keep him moving without him.
Yeah, 100%. I would like to show my respect to Tyrone Crawford too. I mean, yes, his contract didn't necessarily live up to his expectations, but he constantly battled through injuries and of course, he was always viewed as a great team guy and a great team leader. So I definitely hope him the best in retirement. So 17th game was added across the entire NFL for every team, and the Patriots were added as a 17th game on the Cowboys schedule. Quick fact, the Cowboys have lost 6 straight games to the Patriots, although they lead the all-time series 7-6. It would definitely be nice to get that monkey off the Cowboys' back and finally get a win over Bill Belichick. Because
it would be really nice, and it's a very, very different as a team, as everyone knows. There in New England, they didn't have a great year in 2020. Cam Newton didn't really live up to expectations, but Bill Belichick's believing in him. They were active in free agency so far, so I think that'll be a good team. I don't know when we'll play them, if it'll be exactly at the end, but I think this is the time where Dallas can beat them, and it goes beyond just wanting to beat the Patriots. When the Cowboys played the Panthers way back in 2015 when Romo got hurt, I think that's another thing that you can talk about because of that kind of moment. You want to get that revenge on Cam Newton specifically, and there's guys on this team from that team and that will want to get that win. And I think it's a good add to the schedule. And regarding what kind of team you could have gotten, we'll take the Patriots.
Yeah, this is definitely not the same team that the Cowboys have repeatedly lost to with Tom Brady. He came down to Dallas that one year and he was dotting us up. So it's definitely going to be a different team. But I think they made a lot of good moves in free agency in terms of bringing in some talent. But if the Cowboys were going to end that streak, it would need to be this year without Tom Brady and with Cam Newton at the quarterback position.
I agree. And then one thing I want to note, because I saw some chatter on Twitter and Instagram talking about it. What is the economic impact of an extra game? So for this year, I don't know how it'll impact contracts down the road, but for this year specifically, it'll only add a game check that'll be put through the performance pay bonus. So it won't impact any cap hits. And DeMarcus Lawrence is one of 10 guys in the NFL who will be making an extra $1 million in that extra game check.
Wow. Yeah, there's definitely some financial implications with that game. So we're going to go and answer a few questions. We're going to spend the rest of this podcast kind of going over some questions I got on Instagram. At the collector _79 asks, would you trade Michael Gallup for draft picks this year? Use all of the draft picks on defense and draft tight end Kyle Pitts at pick 10.
For me, I just don't know if you're going to get enough out of a trade with Michael Gallup to really make it worth the trade, because he has a great chemistry with Dak Prescott. He has a great chemistry with Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Cedric Wilson, the tight ends. I just don't think you want to take that guy off of a team because he's a great person beyond just being a great player. And I think the draft capital that he could give us wouldn't be much more than a second or third. I think that they would be ecstatic if that's what they were to get out of him. But I don't think you want to let him go. I still agree with using all the picks on defense, and I'm not part of the Kyle Pitts team for number 10.
Yeah, not as big of a Kyle Pitts guy as I am, but we'll get into that later. My personal opinion on this, I think that would have to be a trade that you obviously make on draft day. I mean, first you have to make sure Pitts is even available at pick 10 before you make a trade like that. It's certainly possible that Kyle Pitts could go before the Cowboys are even on the clock. But I would love to see if there's a way to just add Kyle Pitts straight into this lineup and keep those wide receivers. I mean, imagine the weapons Dak Prescott would have with Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb, and Kyle Pitts. I mean, what can you do on defense to stop that? I mean, there's only so many players who you can double team, and with the running back duo of Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott, I mean, that's as an explosive offense as you can get in the NFL. However, it all comes down to if the Cowboys feel confident in signing Gallup long term, and if that's the smartest thing to do with their needs in other positions and their depth with Amari signed long term and CeeDee Lamb in his rookie contract. I think that obviously if you can trade Michael Gallup and get some kind of compensation, that would be preferred over losing him in free agency next season. Next off season. So I would certainly be okay with either. I just don't want to lose him for nothing.
I do agree with that. And I will say that my bias will speak a little bit regarding Michael Gallup because I enjoy him as a player. I've met him. He's a great person, but I do think we're in a weird situation. Of course, Corey Davis, which is the similar contract comparison, didn't get a massive deal. I just worry that Gallup's market is going to be too high for the Cowboys to keep him, and that's going to be something that they have to accept. Of course, wide receivers grow on trees a little bit more than guys like quarterbacks did, and we talked about that last episode. But one thing I'll say, my editor for the Cowboys Wire tweeted it. What if New England were to call and say Pitts was there at 10 and they're offering 15 and 46 for 10 and a fourth rounder? Do you make that deal and give up the chance to get Kyle Pitts and bet that you can take a corner at 15?
I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't because there's a lot of cornerback needy teams around that area too. And I mean, moving to 15 would move us beneath the Giants and the Eagles and would take away our leverage in getting, first pick out of the division. And we could easily see a guy like, if the Patriots moved up there, they wouldn't be drafting Kyle Pitts with their signings of Hunter Henry and Johnny Smith. So that would leave Kyle Pitts possibly to the Philadelphia Eagles. I really don't want to see that.
Yeah, I do not want to see that either.
That's a worst case scenario, I think, for Cowboys fans, is to see the Eagles get a Kyle Pitts. So I personally wouldn't do that. But this whole idea of not wanting to lose big caliber players in free agency for nothing makes me think about when we lost Byron Jones in free agency. I think there was always talk and speculation from fans, especially, that the Cowboys were not going to be able to afford a Byron Jones extension. And I think that we knew that, but we decided to keep him because we wanted to see if we could contend and compete. And then we rode that too far to the point that we weren't able to trade for him because teams knew that they would have a chance in free agency, And a guy like Byron Jones, you would be getting high quality value for all pro cornerback like Byron Jones. So yeah, I feel like as much as you want to keep players, if you can't extend them and it just doesn't really fit the budget, then I would rather just get something and try and rebuild the position instead of setting yourself back and then not being able to get anything for it.
Yeah, I do agree, of course, with this Michael Gallup situation regarding that. I think if they do get a good offer, you kind of have to take it. I think a guy like Cedric Wilson showed a lot of promise last year, especially before Dak's injury in that Seattle game, scoring 2 touchdowns. Who would have saw that coming over there? And I think he can be the guy who fits that role if you don't go somewhere in the draft, maybe late, find a speedster wide receiver. And then talking about that Byron Jones thing, it's just hard to think about because people know that you could have gotten the first or second round pick for Byron Jones regarding his talent. And you see him as a duo with Xavier Howard now at the Dolphins, but that's something you have to live with. But I will say now that we talked about that hypothetical. So what if at 10, if you have Pitts, Surtain, Horn, and Rashawn Slater from Northwestern, who do you go with there? I think you're going Kyle Pitts. But what do you say? And I'll give you an argument back.
I'm going Surtain personally. Right there on the screen, this shows my recent updated big board. I moved around some players following injuries and pro days. I have Caleb Farley dropping all the way down to 8 with his injury news. And I brought up JC Horn up a lot. He rose. I still think I love Patrick Surtain as a prospect. I do. I'm as big of a believer as I think any Cowboys fan is, and I'm really, and I would love to see him in Dallas. He has a complete package in terms of his technique and in terms of his coverage and just his natural talent. I think the one question he had was his speed, and he showed at his pro day that he's a very fast player. He ran I think it was a 4.40 or is it slightly underneath it?
Yeah,
I'm not sure. Yeah,
it was below a 4.5.
Yeah, it was it was below a 4.5, which already, if it had been a 4.5 with his 6'2" height, it wouldn't have been that big of a knock on him. You would take it. So the fact he ran a 4.4 is definitely preferred. Okay, he officially ran a 4.46. That's very good for a guy of his height and who had everything else going for him. So yeah, I would go with Surtain, and then I would go Pitts, and then I would go Horn, and then probably Slater would be my 4th pick between those 4.
Well, then I'll tell you what. You can put Slater and Kyle Pitts down at the bottom for me, and then 1A and 1B, however you want to figure it out, with Surtain and Horn. I am not one who's normally very high on combines or pro days, but Surtain had great numbers, and Horn said, you know what, let me one up every single one of those. And I think that was something to note. I think JC Horn is an underrated prospect, and I think if they're both there, I would not be surprised if there was potential of JC Horn being the pick. Although Surtain is a match made in heaven, he has great relations with Trayvon Diggs. He fits that corner the same way JC Horn does, that Dan Quinn wants, and I just think it's too much of a fit for the Cowboys to pass up on.
I think one player that Cowboys fans as a whole, I think, are overlooking as a potential pick. I think Micah Parsons is a guy who I know we have bigger needs on the defensive side of the ball than Parsons, but Parsons is a beast. I think I would not be shocked if Parsons ended up being the best defensive player in this draft. I mean, I think he's clearly linebacker one in my opinion, and he's been pretty outgoing on his Instagram page about wanting to play in Dallas, and he said that was his preferred destination. So I personally would love to see us have interest in Parsons, and I think that that's a guy who we should still consider as a possibility for Dallas with our linebacker core being kind of shaky last season.
Yeah, I do agree. I think, but if we, like we talked about earlier, if we get a guy like KJ Wright, I think he falls off that situation because the need wouldn't be as huge. But Micah Parsons is a guy who didn't play last year. There's a lot of questions regarding him, but people know his talent. People know he can go out there and have maybe a comparison to a guy like Isaiah Simmons, who can move around like a safety, but he has all that linebacker strength and prowess when it comes to getting down into the trenches.
For sure. Okay, so we're going to move on to another question from @JDID516. He asked, what is going to happen to Blake Jarwin's role now? It's interesting with Dalton Schultz coming out last year and really impressing and having a better season than expected.
So for me, I think the first thing I'll say is I was really proud of Dalton Schultz last year. First game of the year, you're coming off of a non-existent offseason due to COVID, and in the first half of the first game, you see Blake Jarwin, your guy right above you, go down, and you're mainly a blocking guy, and all of a sudden you have to step in there for Dak Prescott and be that starting tight end catching balls. And I think he really proved himself. Of course, took away from him a little bit when Dak got hurt, but he was still able to produce some big moments, including a game-winning touchdown later in the season. And I think he can be a big part of this offense next year. And it is something that is going to be a strong debate for the Cowboys staff, but I think Jarwin is still the starter, but Schultz brings a little bit more versatility as a blocker. And you talk about a guy like Ezekiel Elliott in the backfield, you can go 2 tight end sets, and that experience for Schultz allows him to be out there. So you can run play action and get both of those guys out there in the flat on a route. I think it was honestly kind of a blessing in a way for Dallas that Schultz was able to get those kind of snaps, and I think he can be an integral part of the offense just as much as Jarwin is.
Yeah, personally, I would give the starting role still to Schultz. I think I think he earned it, and I think that he showed that he is a great player. But I understand that Jarwin has more of an explosiveness factor, and he's really shown his speed and just his explosiveness to get open vertically. But one thing is Dalton Schultz is a tremendous run blocker, and I think that was something that kind of hurt Jarwin. And when he was backing up Jason Witten, they would definitely have Jason Witten in on run blocking plays because he was a better run blocker. So I would totally give Schultz the edge, I think, in that regard. But I think the question becomes even more, what if the Cowboys do end up going Kyle Pitts? What happens to Blake Jarwin at that point? I think if the Cowboys added Kyle Pitts, I think it would make Jarwin really expendable because Schultz is always going to be valuable because of his run blocking ability. And I mean, if you're adding a Kyle Pitts, I mean, that's just a more explosive and more talented and athletic tight end. So I think
I do agree with that. I think, of course, that Jarwin type of role, we talked about it. I still think Jarwin is the receiving starter, so to speak, but Schultz has more versatility, and half the time you're going to want him on the field to make it seem like there might be a run play coming in play action regarding Blake Jarwin. If he's on the field out there lined up right next to Tyron Smith, they're going to be anticipating a pass a little bit more than a run, and I think that takes away from the unpredictability of the offense. But having both on there is something we'll have to see. Of course, if a Kyle Pitts draft pick does happen, of course that changes everything. But I think seeing the offense out there on the field will give a really good idea of how they're going to use both of them on the field at one time.
Yeah, for sure. So at I_VanX_ asked, what's the most important skill set that we as a team need to improve? I personally would have to go with run defense and our pass coverage. I mean, that's pretty much defense as a whole.
It's just defense as a whole.
It's just defense, but we definitely need to be better against the run. There's too many plays where running backs are easily getting 6-7 yards last season.
Mm-hmm.
It's just hard to watch as a fan. And I think with losing Chidobe Awuzie, we kind of have a hole at that cornerback position. I don't think he was necessarily great, and it's not a huge loss since we are drafting at pick 10. But I definitely think that those are the two positions that the Cowboys need to address the most.
Yeah, I saw that question, and I will agree there. The defense as a whole is an issue, but I will say beyond just the X and O's of like production on the field, I think something that the team learned from 2020 is resiliency and being healthy. So you don't have a full off season. You have a bunch of injuries. Of course, I'm not going to relate that exactly to the Dak Prescott injury because that's just a freak thing that happens. But being resilient in the situation that you are when it's injuries and adversity on the field, that defense got beat up. And you even saw in games like the Falcons game and the Browns game, they had moments where they could step up and get a stop. And I think that's something that they can learn. I don't think the defense will be great this year, but they need to learn to have a very, very short memory.
Yeah, for sure. I 100% agree with you. So at tyb.angel_ asked, what do you think our record will be this season? And it's interesting because this record will be the first and most unique record in Cowboys history with the new 17-game format. There's no going 8-8 unless we get a freak tie going on. So it'll definitely be interesting to see. I think we need to have a show where we go through every single game, especially when the schedule releases and you see what games we open with, what week of the season and all that. I would love to go and break down each individual game. But just thinking off the top of my head right now with what team we should aspire to be, I think we should aspire to be an 11-12 win team this upcoming season. I think that that's a good number for us to be at. I think anything below that would kind of be a disappointment. And I think we're even capable of doing more than that. But I think with the question marks on defense and with the fact that we didn't even make the playoffs last year, I think we got to be a little bit I just think that we got to be a little bit understanding in terms of what our expectations should be.
Yeah, I do agree. And I think beyond just that 11, I love that 11-12 win number. I think that's where we need to be. But I think beyond that, I think we need to be 5-1 or 6-0 in the division. I think that's the biggest thing because in a division that is not as good as it has been in the past, of course, it's a very storied division. You're not going to get an opportunity like this year where none of them have a really set-in quarterback. And I think having that opportunity, you don't want to give up a game to, let's say, the Washington football team, and then Ryan Fitzmagic goes and wins 4 straight games, and now they're up in the division and you're behind. You don't want to get there. You don't want to give out free games to the division. And I think that's where the Cowboys have been really good the years that they've been 12-4 or 10-6. They win all of their division games and make sure that they can't chase them head-to-head.
Yeah, 100%. I think those division games are huge, especially in a division that really is – it's not competitive in an NFL broad spectrum, but it's definitely competitive within the division. It's very close every year. So at RJ_Norton asks, who do you think will be our breakout performer this year on the team? My pick. I personally – would have to go with Trevon Diggs, probably. I think would be one of them for sure. I think a second year with the system and with a new defensive coordinator, I think he'll be lights out. And especially with the way he ended his season last season, I think he really showed flashes and signs of that he was improving over the back end of the season. So I would definitely put him as one of those guys.
I'll start with a guy on offense that didn't get enough talk in 2020 because he got injured, but I think Tyler Biadasz is going to be the breakout guy on that offense because you have injuries to virtually everyone else on the offensive line, and he stepped up for Joe Looney and pretty much took the starting spot for him before he got injured. I think he's not a massive guy, very comparable to Travis Frederick, but he is a incredible double team blocker and help blocker. And that'll be really good when they want to run in between the tackles. It'll be really good in pass protection against four-man rushes, and he really commanded that offense well. And then on the defensive end, I absolutely agree with Trayvon Diggs. He had great plays in even a season where it seemed like he wasn't really up to par for his standards, but he was able to make big plays. People talk about that DK punch out. He had a bunch of picks late in the season. I think he can be a guy that creates turnovers and really shuts guys down once he gets his technique really mastered on the outside. And then another name to talk about is Donovan Wilson, who really exploded at the end of the year. When you see guys, we talked about it last episode, they're always around the ball. Safeties that can do that are always great players, and I think he can be someone who can become a great starter. Of course, you get a guy like Keanu Neal, you get a guy like KZ to go alongside him. He won't have to worry about the ball over the top because he has guys helping him out, and I think that allows him to play with a little bit more looseness and aggression in this defense.
Yeah, 100%. I think all three of those names were great points and great players to point out for that. At Robert.Caulfield asks if Certain and Pitts are on the board, who are you taking? We kind of discussed this a little bit earlier. Definitely. It's really a 1A, 1B.
It's a tough
decision. It's a toss-up because I think Surtain is a great prospect, and I think he's a bigger need than Kyle Pitts. But Kyle Pitts could very well end up having the most successful career outside of a quarterback position in this draft. I mean, it's very possible, and it's really a need versus a pure talent and a best player available type of debate.
Yeah, I think beyond just that, as like on the field, you could draft Kyle Pitts and not even want to play him and hold him for ransom. Same thing when people were discussing if Cowboys are going to have a top 5 pick. I know that doesn't sound correct, but like you can look around for trades because there's going to be guys that want Kyle Pitts, and you can trade them for, let's say, a pick that's going to give you Surtain, a pick that's going to give you Horn, and then some for Kyle Pitts because people want that offensive talent. And then let's say you aren't even able to get a deal like that with it. What's wrong with having Kyle Pitts on your offense? It's a win-win.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. I hadn't even considered that. We could totally draft Kyle Pitts and then try and make a trade with him after drafting him. That would totally be an option. Yeah, I think it's a 1A, 1B type of situation. I would be ecstatic if the Cowboys were able to get either of those players. I'd feel very good about our draft. I think it really comes down to need versus best player available, and it really just depends on how our front office views that situation, you know. So I think if we get Pitts, it would definitely have to be a very defensive heavy draft after him. Like I'm talking just straight defense after that pick. I mean, and honestly, I think there's a lot of good players who could be available at that second round pick. I mean, we're picking 10th pick in the second round. I mean, you can find a lot of
spots.
Yeah, exactly. It opens a lot of great options throughout the rest of the draft. So I think the Cowboys are sitting in a very good spot in the draft.
Yeah, and then I saw on your big board you had Trevon Moehrig down at the bottom. I think that's a really underrated prospect. He could end up going late in the first round, but I really think he's a really good player. You talk about the safeties that we already added. You have a guy like Donovan Wilson. You have a guy like KZ. Of course, Keanu Neal's now moving into that linebacker role, but he can still get into the back of the defense if he has to. But I think Moehrig's a ball hawk. He could bring a lot to the defense, and I think with that 10th pick in the second round, they'll have a lot of opportunities. And maybe even a guy like Barmore will be there if they're lucky.
Yeah, I would totally. I mean, imagine if the Cowboys could draft Kyle Pitts 10 and then trade back in late first round or trade up even higher in the second round, and they could get a guy like Barmore or a Moehrig. I mean, that would be, I think, an exceptional draft, and I think the Cowboys organization and fan base would have to be really ecstatic at that point.
Yeah, and then what I'll say, let's imagine I don't know what Caleb Farley's stock is going to be regarding his injury, but let's say we go Surtain at 10 and then we get around 30 or so and Farley's still there due to the injury. Do you trade up and get him and just add another
I think
corner?
you just double up, honestly. I think you double up.
I don't think you can go wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally would double up. I think that Farley was really being talked about as cornerback one by a lot of people before his injury.
On that team.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there were a lot of people who considered him the best cornerback. I personally had him as my cornerback 2. Then with the injury, I switched to J.C. Horn and him, moved him down to 3rd. But personally, I mean, that would really make, I think, Cowboys fans feel confident in the cornerback room if you could add Surtain, Farley, and Diggs, and then you'd have Jordan Lewis and then Anthony Brown in the slot. I mean, that would be a great room, I think. A youthful room, a young room, definitely. And
really
it would definitely lack experience.
I think that's what Dan Quinn wants.
But I think that's what he wants.
Can build them. I think that'll be the perfect situation for that defense.
Yeah, exactly. So last question. Well, second to last question. Last question relating to the Cowboys. At Plastastic 55 asks, plain and simply, Dak or Romo? Who are you going with? Who's the better player, Dak or Tony Romo?
You're going to have to give me a moment here. Who is the better football player? At this very moment, I'm still going to take Dak Prescott because I think the prowess that Dak has shown early in his career is beyond. Of course, Romo stepped up and was good, but I don't think he was like worthy of that conversation that Dak is now already being like in that conversation as a top 5 quarterback and commanding such a massive contract that he got just so recently. And I think both of them, they're both great people. I don't have to discuss that. People know that. And I just think Dak, of course, is just getting started and has that opportunity to overcome that legacy that Romo had. But I think it's also good to note their relationship and connection they have as Cowboys quarterbacks.
I think there's a lot of different angles and takes that you can take with this debate. And I think there's different reasons for why you could pick either player. I think that overall player, just talent versus talent, I'd probably take as an overall player, I'd probably pick Dak. But in terms of pure passing, I'd probably go Tony Romo.
Yeah.
But also, I think with Tony Romo having the better pure passing ability, I think he was a little bit risky throughout his career and threw a lot of interceptions that did take the Cowboys out of games. I think with Dak, you have more insurance on not turning the ball over through interceptions. And a lot of Dak's interceptions have been from tipped passes and just drops from receivers.
I'll definitely say it's definitely been a frustrating thing when you discuss with people regarding Dak's stats. It's like, oh, he's got all these interceptions or whatever. I'm like, I do not want to hear that when I see that offensive line get beat up. A ball gets tipped at the line. A ball gets tipped or dropped by a wide receiver and lands in somebody's hands. Like Gallup had the drops for a little bit. Amari had the drops for a little bit. I think that's something that needs to be noted. And then talk about that pure passer thing. I definitely agree with that. And then another thing I'll ask you, I don't think you can really say it yet for Dak, but who do you think's more clutch?
Who's more clutch? That's a tough one. I would have to go with Dak just because I've seen Dak come back in a lot of games and bring the Cowboys back. I mean, this past season with the Atlanta Falcons, I mean, that game should have been over and wrapped up. And I bet there were a lot of Cowboys fans who left that arena early who are kicking themselves for it. I mean, Dak brought them back in that situation. So I would go Dak. I think right now, if you're talking about who's the better Cowboys quarterback all time, it has to be Tony Romo since he leads in pretty much every passing stat on the all-time list of Cowboys quarterbacks. However, I think by the time his career is over, Dak Prescott will be the better quarterback than Tony Romo. And I think it's very possible that he could actually beat those stats on that all-time board of passing stats in Cowboys history. I think being such a late round pick, Dak even being mentioned among like a Tony Romo and mentioned among those kind of players is great for him. And I think he clearly outdid what he was projected. But now with his big contract that he got and what he's shown, I think it would be a disappointment if he didn't go deeper than Tony Romo went in his Cowboys career. He's got to go deeper than the divisional game to really have that all-time like great Cowboy like. Yeah.
I definitely
all-time
agree
great
with that.
reputation.
And I think, of course, everybody talks about Romo not getting over that hump. Of course, was it really his fault? We can get into a discussion like that another time about the Dez catch and everything. But people say that I definitely agree that Romo's prime was wasted in Dallas, and he's never going to get the credit he deserved. Of course, that year, I thought if he beat Aaron Rodgers in that game, he might have been the MVP. I think that was another conversation. He was in that voting, and
He was.
Dak isn't there yet. But
or third.
Hopefully, I'm dreaming that we don't have to come back to this conversation, and Dak will surround himself as the greatest Cowboys quarterback of all time, and even challenge the guy like Roger Staubach or Troy Aikman when we talk something like that.
He's got to win a Super Bowl first, in my opinion, before you start making those kind of debates.
I agree.
I mean, Staubach brought 2, and Troy Aikman brought 3. So I mean, I think you got to at least bring 1 to even be in that discussion. Hopefully,
that's definitely where I'm going with that argument. I think that first ring is when you can start discussing it because, of course, I think Staubach was the leader of that team. I think Aikman was a great quarterback, but I don't think he was the leader of that team. I think Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin led that team and were the main stars, while Dak Prescott on this team, of course, in 2016, it was Zeke's team. That's not the case anymore. As good as I still think Zeke is, this is Dak's football team, and that's something that he can hold against a guy like Troy Aikman if we're going to make that type of a conversation. But I think you can start making that conversation if Dak were to lead this team to a Super Bowl, because if he were to do that, I think his numbers would be ridiculous, and hopefully we get to have that conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So last question. March Madness tonight, the national championship. Who do you have between Gonzaga and Baylor? Who's going to end up the national champion after tonight?
I'll tell you what. Before Saturday, I was already leaning towards Gonzaga. I had them in like 3 of my different draft groups, and I saw Baylor put the smacking on poor old Houston, and I immediately thought, can they beat this Gonzaga team? And then I watched that game with Gonzaga and UCLA, and I think Gonzaga winning that type of a game in overtime like that says a lot more than a blowout, because you always see every national championship team has that one game that really scares them, but they're able to overcome it. And I'm going to take Gonzaga, I'll say 84-82.
I think it's going to be a great game. I think these are the 2 best teams in the country in basketball, and I think that this is especially what you would be asking for as a college basketball fan. I got Baylor. Strictly because I think it's really, really hard for a team to make it all the way and go undefeated. Yeah, it would be magnificent, and it would be incredible from Gonzaga. Maybe Gonzaga already had their scare, and maybe that was their chance to blow it, and Jalen Suggs came through for them. But I'm going to go with Baylor 77-74. I think it's going to be a great game. I think it's going to be a really close game, and I'm excited to see what happens from it. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap up the DC Squad pod. Thank you all for watching. And again, big shout out and thank you to the U Stadium brand and organization. Make sure to follow my Instagram at Dallas Cowboys Squad and follow Cameron's Twitter account at CDBurnett7 for all these Cowboys news and updates. I'm so excited to keep doing this stream with you guys and I keep following the Cowboys throughout this draft process.
All right. See you guys.
All right. Thank you. See you.